What is your concept of God? I mean, like, in terms of size, what is your concept of God? And I ask you what your concept of God is because the way you view God, your concept of Him really determines everything. All right? But what many of us do is we kind of put a box together for God, right? I mean, we have a box that He fits in. We kind of compartmentalize our lives, and so, this is the areas in this box. God, you can play with all these areas, but these areas I kind of keep for me. I think sometimes we will put God in a box without even realizing it. Because what we want to do is we want to put God in a box where He's kind of manageable, right? I mean, we'll put Him in a box that we can easily carry, we can easily put our arms around, and that's where we put God, because we want to put God in a box that's comfortable enough that we can grab it and take it out and open it quickly when we need it. And so we're like, okay, God, so here's this spot that I've made for you, and you're going to kind of have to fit in here. But here's the thing, loved ones, is that if your God fits in a box, then your God is too small. And if that's you in your life, that you've put God in just this certain area, in this certain box, then you're actually going to encounter a lot more fear and anxiety and stress than you need to. Because if you keep God confined to those certain areas of your life, then your God's not going to be big enough to come through for you. He's not going to be big enough to come to. He's not big enough to challenge you, to take a risk when you need to. And so life becomes routine, it becomes mundane, it becomes boring. Or maybe it's just that maybe your box is plenty big, but maybe it's just mislabeled. Maybe the label on your box says, God could never use me. Or God doesn't work that way anymore. Or we've never done it this way before. Or for me, it's too late. Or I'm too broken. Or too far gone. Well, this week I hope you had a chance to read chapter 11 of the story. And we see that chapter titled From Shepherd to King. And we read about the life of David before he became King David. In the Old Testament, we're in 1 Samuel. And as we study this together, I hope that we're going to find a few things together that will blow up your box, if indeed you have one. So again, if you want to turn to the book of 1 Samuel in the Old Testament, chapter 16, where the first thing we're going to look at is God's anointing. And we're going to build a sentence throughout the message today, and that sentence starts that God can use anyone. God can use anyone. Okay, so enter the character that we're discussing today, that being David. All right, now, at this time, David is a shepherd. Okay? Not great. You remember, we've talked about shepherds, and you maybe remember a few Christmases ago, we did Characters of Christmas, and we did I Want to Be a Shepherd, and we kind of talked about how being a shepherd was not really the highest calling of the day, right? They weren't noted as deep thinkers or big-time leaders. It was more of a chore than it was really even a job, certainly not a career that you want. You really just didn't want it at all. All right? You would just basically just go sent out in the field if you were the youngest or the least useful. You were sent out in the field, okay, you watch the sheep. All right? Sheep are not super active. They're just kind of there. And so he's out there in the field, and time is just passing by. Right? So he's out there, he's in the field, he's got a mundane job. He starts singing some songs, and he's slinging some rocks. Because that's what you do, right? Actually, my brother and I, the first job that we had growing up was mowing the grass at a graveyard, okay? And it took a long time, and you're just going back and forth. It really wasn't super stimulating to the brain. You just kind of go back and forth. And so you do things like this to pass the time. And I remember we used to actually, we didn't decide that we were going to do it. You just kind of do something to pass the time. And I used to just sing out loud at the top of my lungs. I mean, I'm just there by myself. until I wasn't, and then that was kind of awkward, but all of a sudden the caretaker was 14 feet away and you didn't see him. Anyway, that was fun. But you do what you need to do to pass the time. And so there's David. He's out there. He's a shepherd. What a life. Time just passing by, and he's keeping busy. So meanwhile, we have the prophet Samuel. Now, we were introduced to the prophet Samuel last week and how God speaks to him and lets him know what he's doing. And we know that God had left Saul because of his disobedience, King Saul, that is. And so the word of God comes to Samuel and says, I'm going to select a new king. I'm going to anoint a new king, and it will be one of Jesse's sons. So go to his house, and we will anoint this new king. And so he goes to Jesse. He lets Jesse know he's coming. Bring out your sons, and one will be anointed as king. And so he's going over the sons, the 7 other sons other than David. And they're not finding the king. And then finally, after he goes through them all, he asks to see David. Now, this is what's funny is, again, like Samuel didn't show up unannounced. Jesse knows that he's coming. He says, one of your sons is going to be anointed king, but not all the sons were there. Because why would he bring out David, the youngest, the smallest? Why bother? That was the program that Jesse was on. That was Saul's program as well. And you know what? Samuel is still on that program as well. We see in 1 Samuel 16, verses 6 and 7, it says, when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance nor his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And sometimes it's hard for us to remember that God doesn't look at the things that you look at either. He doesn't look at the things that I see first either. And so the thought that God would use somebody like David is just so far out of Jesse's box that he doesn't even bring him in from the field. He's not even there when Samuel arrives. And so as Samuel goes over son after son after son, and it's not him, finally he says, well, don't you have any more sons? And Jesse's kind of like, well, yeah, I guess. There's one more. But he's the runt. He's the shepherd, he's just kind of, he probably smells like the sheep. I could bring him in, but, he's too young. He's too young, right? Or he's too small. Kind of like how Abraham, he was too old. And Rahab, remember her? She's probably too guilty. Gideon, he was too scared. Joseph, he was too hard done by. But what we have seen, and what we see here, and what we continue to see, and will continue to see, is that God can use whoever He wants. That includes me, that includes you. He can use anybody. And surely, as we have studied the story together, that emerging theme is hard to miss. That God selects who He will select to do His purposes. God can use anybody. So that's God's anointing. Here's the second thing that comes up is opportunities. God's opportunities. So we see that God can use anyone to do anything. All right, we're moving along here. So if you want to turn to the next chapter, 1 Samuel 17. So this is what's wild, is Samuel comes, he says, this is the Lord's anointed. David is anointed. He's going to be the next king. It happened right there in front of everyone. And they're like, all right, you're the Lord's anointed. As you were. He goes right back out to the field. He goes right back to the sheep. There really wasn't much that changed immediately for David. But he was anointed by God, and yet he still goes back to the field. He still goes back to singing songs and slinging rocks and watching sheep. That just has to be strange. You know more clearly than most people who feel called by God. You were anointed by the prophet. You're to be king. And then he just goes back to normal. But things do start to progress, and David does find himself in the palace, but not as the king, not yet. David is brought to King Saul's palace, and because he's quite the musician, he plays the harp to soothe the depressed and forsaken King Saul. As we noted last week, and as we noted earlier this morning, that God had left Saul because of his disobedience. But David plays for him, and it makes him feel better, and he actually develops a close relationship with Saul, and especially with Saul's son Jonathan. And someday I hope we'll get a chance to really look into that relationship. There was scarcely a friendship as close as that one in the Bible. But while all this is going on, during that time there was some trouble brewing. And if there is one story that you know from 1 Samuel, it's this one. Okay? There was this Philistine warrior. He was a giant. I don't know if you heard of him. He was called Goliath. And he was like a great, big, huge, like killing machine. And he was a serious warrior, and he was a serious threat to the army of Israel. And so here's this huge giant, and he comes out and he paces back and forth each day, defying the ranks of Israel, defying their army, mocking the true God of Israel. He calls out the army. He calls out God. And then enter David. This small David, young David, inexperienced David. The only reason he was even there is because Jesse said, hey, why don't you go see your brothers on the front line and pack a lunch? All right? In there it says, hey, bring some loaves and cheese. So he basically comes out with cheese and crackers. He's got a snack pack, for a break, in between the whole punchy stuff, right? And so there he is, and David, the Lord's anointed, he sees this giant. Not only that, but he hears what he's saying. He hears this Philistine who is mocking God. And basically he comes up in verse 26 and he says, who is this guy? Who is this guy? Look at verse 26. He says, David asked the man standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So he's worked up about this. He's upset about this. Look at verses 32 and 33. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. And listen to Saul's reply. He says, you are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only young, a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. And that's something that many Christians who have God in a box will tell you. When you feel led to do something, do something powerful, do something big for the Lord, Christians who have God in a box will discourage you. They'll say, you can't do that. Or God's not going to do that. Or God doesn't work like that anymore. But when you realize the power that you're calling on and that he can't be contained to that box, it's amazing what can be done. And we know the story. And as fun as it would be to describe, I actually have a pretty, I think, historically accurate, obviously we don't have footage of what it actually looked like, but we've got a pretty epic recreation of this encounter between David and Goliath that I want to show for you. I just want to give you a little warning. It might be a little intense, but it is really, I think, shows the essence of what has taken place.
Who will fight me, Goliath?
I will.
You?
All right, so you were warned. Viewer discretion, okay? Now look, you laugh, but they laughed at David, okay? it really, for David to go out to Goliath, looked just as ridiculous as that. Right? They were like, are you kidding? You think that you're going to go out before Goliath? You're going to get stomped. He's going to chew you up and spit you out in front of everyone. He was laughed at. He was discouraged from fighting. But David knew that God was on his side, and that was the key. You see, David was well aware. He was well aware of the mismatch. But probably not the mismatch that you're thinking about. Okay, David saw a mismatch. He saw a huge, giant, and powerful God against a man. David saw the mismatch. In verses 45 and 47, it says, David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, who you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals. The whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you all into our hands. See, the victory, it wasn't David's. And it wasn't even the army of Israel. The battle belonged to the Lord. But see, if you've got God in a box, then you become the what-if guy. Well, what if he's too strong? What if I can't do it? What if this or that or whatever else? See, David wasn't thinking what if. David was thinking who. Who is with me? I think that David would say to us today, why do you call this story David and Goliath? Why do you call it David versus Goliath? It was God versus Goliath. And he defeated Goliath by slinging a rock at him that killed him. But by David confronting this problem and being victorious over it, he shows us that God can use anybody to do anything. And he does it again and again and again. It's almost like he stacks the odds against himself, as we keep noticing. All right, let's finish the sentence. So the third thing we see here is God's timing. And so the full sentence reads, God can use anyone to do anything at any time. So, from the time that we first read of David being anointed to be king, some 20 years pass before he actually takes the throne. That's a long time. And it's difficult for us, right? Because God's timing is rarely ever the same as our timing or what we think should happen. And it can be so difficult, can it, to wait on what God is doing. Sometimes we wait so long that it feels like maybe he's forgotten all about us. There's David. He's anointed as king, and again, he goes back, and he's in the palace, and he's on the run. David was actually on the run from Saul for 10 years of this time he's waiting. Saul learned that David was the anointed, the new anointed of the Lord, and he wasn't much of a fan of that. He wasn't quite ready to give up the throne. And so a few different times he tries to kill David. He tries to pin him to the wall, even as he plays the harp. David is courageous, though, and he waits. And again, it wasn't just waiting around for the long weekend. He was waiting a long time. And sometimes that's just a courageous way to live. I mean, you think about how agonizing, how hard it's been just for us to wait for COVID to be over with, where we can just, do the things that we want to do and go about our lives. It's been over a year, and we're just like, oh my goodness, is this ever going to end? And look at the time that's passed as David waits to fulfill his purpose as the Lord's anointed. And even inside of that, he had opportunities to take it into his own hands and try and expedite the process, right? Like there's a time where David has got Saul's back to him in a cave. He's got his weapon drawn. He could have ended Saul right then. He gets so close that he actually slices off a little piece of his cloak and even shows it to him. Like, hey, I've got taken you out. It says that he would not put a hand on the Lord's anointed. It's hard to wait. We see David write a song about it or write a psalm about it. Psalm 40, verses 1 to 3 says, I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in Him. You see, David's focus, even in the waiting, was on God's greatness and on God's might, God's power. And that's why so many of the songs and psalms that he wrote were about that. They were about the bigness and the greatness of our God. So, as we pose this question, or this statement, I guess again, is God can use anybody to do anything at any time, I just want to ask you if you believe that. Do you believe that God can use anyone to do anything at any time? Because your concept of God and how big He is and what He can do determines everything. And I think the reason why we can often find ourselves living predictable and safe lives, why we're often pinned in by stress and anxiety and fear, is because we've just made God too small in our lives. We fit Him into our box. So here's what I want to tell you, loved ones. If God only ever operates on your timetable, your God is too small. If your God is always saying come but never saying go, your God is too small. If your God never asks you to do something that feels a little bit outside of your capacity or budget, your God is too small. If your God needs a certain prime minister to be in power to accomplish his purpose, your God is too small. If your God says that you're too old, or you're too young, or you're too broken, or you're too poor, or you're too late, too whatever, your God is too small. If He somehow fits into a box, no matter the size, He's too small. See,